Last Saturday, April 7th, which was on April 17th, I posted a quote on Pretty's group page that read, "A flower does not think of competing with the flower next to it. It just blooms." But do we really believe this quote or others like it? It's easy to look at someone on social media, TV, even at work and think, wow, I wish I was built like her. Or, man, her life is perfect. What we seem to be forgetting, though, is that God has uniquely created each and every one of us, and we're all beautiful in our own way. Our title for today is The Comparison Trap. And James 3:16 provides the perfect reminder for this topic. And it reads, "For where there is envy and selfish ambition, there is disorder and every evil practice." So, in this particular scripture, James is condemning those who leave God and his values out of their way of life. He's focusing on wisdom and envy. Now, when James speaks about wisdom, he's not talking about how much a person knows, like how smart they are. He's actually referring to how a person lives daily. So, how do they take the things that God has taught them and apply it to their daily living, to their daily lives? So, simply put, envy is the feeling of wanting to have what someone else has. So many times we get caught up comparing ourselves to others. I believe, and also the word actually says that this is a trap that often begins in our minds and in our hearts. If our relationship with Jesus is lacking in any way, it's easy. That's the prime time for the enemy to take over our thoughts. And by this, I mean that if we aren't focused on what God says about us, then we're focused on the opposite. The enemy can lead us to believe that we are less than. And I know we've all probably felt that way at some point of our lives. It could be on any random day. And this voice from the enemy, it can come from various sources. It can come from significant others. It could be from images on social media or TV. It can even come from family, unfortunately. Comparing ourselves to others can lead us to some negative spaces. Some of those negative spaces include depression, feelings of unfulfillment, like we just aren't enough. And in severe cases, it can even lead us to having thoughts of suicide. Let's talk a little bit more about envy. So, envy equals negativity. If we think about a time when we have been envious of someone or someone has been envious of us, the environment and the atmosphere is one of confusion, disorder. There is absolutely no harmony whatsoever. People are not seeing eye to eye usually. This confusion and harmony can be within us because we're wishing so hard that we were more like someone else in some way. Or the confusion and the disharmony can just be in the air, like in the environment, similar to tension, just due to the envious and or jealous behavior that's taking place wherever we are. Again, this can be at work, it can be in family relationships, it can be in romantic relationships. Envy also equals sin. And I'm sure you guys know that it's one of the 7 deadly sins, but I want to put this little reminder in here that no one sin is greater than the other. And a lot of times people get caught up thinking, oh, well, she did that, so that's way worse than me telling a lie. Or, you know how people are, like they feel like, well, murder is the worst sin of all. Or they might feel like infidelity is a bad sin. It's the worst sin out there. But God tells us that no one sin is worse than the other. So envy is just as bad as all those other things. The word tells us that it's a matter of the flesh, which means that envy is the result of our human sin. In Proverbs 14 and 30, we are told that a heart at peace gives life to the body, but envy rots the bones. So simply put, being envious is bad for your health. We have exactly what God deemed for us to have. Therefore, there's no need to be envious or jealous of someone else. And let's face it, ladies, we sin enough. So we don't need to add envy to the other sins that we partake in. Let's look at some examples from the word where someone was comparing themselves to, or they were envious of another person. So the first example is one that I know we're all familiar with, and that one is Cain and Abel. And that story is in Genesis 4. So we know that Cain killed his little brother Abel, his own brother, simply because they had both made sacrifices to God, but God was more pleased. He was pleased with Abel's sacrifice and not with Cain's. So that infuriated Cain. He was jealous. He was upset about that, and he killed his own brother. Another example of envy and comparison, this one has to do with women, because that's where I want to focus. This one is with Leah and Rachel, which can be found in Genesis 29. So we talked about Leah and Rachel in our talk titled Accept Rejection. And if you remember, Leah was envious of Rachel because Jacob, which was their husband, which is a whole other set of issues, but Jacob loved Rachel more. Rachel was the best thing ever to him. He could have definitely done without Leah. And so at the same time, Rachel was envious of Leah because Leah was the one who was able to bear the sons for Jacob at first. So at the time, the situation had turned into a mess for both women. But when it was all said and done, Leah's son Judah is the one who ended up being the direct descendant of Jesus. Let's look at the example of Sarah and Hagar. In that story, is a little bit more lengthy, but it starts about Genesis 16 and ends around Genesis 23. Sarah was married to Abraham, but she could not conceive. So she had a servant named Hagar, and she allowed her husband Abraham to sleep with Hagar. Of course, Hagar became pregnant and she gave birth to a son. Sarah, as you can already guess, was not happy about this. And so she began to treat Hagar horribly, so bad that Hagar ran off into the wilderness and was like, I don't even want to be around her. But Sarah was very, very, very envious of the fact that Hagar was able to produce this son for her husband, even though it was her idea. She allowed their relationship to happen. I would like to give you 4 elements to remember so that you don't get caught up in this comparison trap. So number 1 is compare yourself to God. If you have to compare yourself to anybody, let God be the person that you compare yourself to. In 1 Corinthians 11:1, Paul is telling the Corinthians to imitate him because Paul is imitating Christ, and that is who should be our prime, our shining example. So if we can look at God and then look at ourselves and see some similarities or see many similarities, then that should tell us that we're on the right track. Number 2, we need to support and cheer for one another, especially as women. So many times, and I know we all probably have some stories where you were expecting a woman to support you and be there for you, and she didn't for whatever reason. So number 2, again, is to support and cheer for one another. We need to make this a habit because we should be each other's biggest cheerleaders. I found an example of women being each other's cheerleaders in Judges 4 and 5. And this is the story of Deborah and Jael. It's Jael. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. So Deborah was judging Israel at this time, which meant that she would settle any disputes that they had among the people. So Deborah ends up going to the battle site with the troops with the plan that she would lure Sisera in. Now, Sisera was this man, he had all this power at the time, but the plan was that she was going to go into battle with the troops and she was going to lure this man in and kill him. So Deborah tells the commander that he will not get any fame of this on this trip because the Lord will sell Sisera to a woman. Now, Deborah ends up not being the woman, but instead it was Jael. And what Jael did was she ended up killing Sisera with a tent peg to the head. She literally took this tent peg, hammered it in this man's temple, and killed him. When they got back from the battle, instead of Deborah being envious, she celebrated by writing a song in Jael's honor. And so I thought that was an excellent example, again, for us as women to support one another, to be each other's cheerleaders, be there, help her through whatever she might be going through. Number 3, excuse me, is focus on how you can make yourself better than you were yesterday. Mm-hmm. So identify your faults. We all have them. Be real with yourself about those faults. Be willing to change. And change is hard, but it's also necessary sometimes. We also need to love ourselves, faults and all. When we're going through tough times, it's hard to accept that Jesus still loves us, but he actually does. He really does. But we also have to love ourselves through the good, bad, or the ugly. The final, number 4, the final element is to remember that God created you to be unique and beautiful. And we can see that in Song of Songs 4 and 7, because it tells us that you are absolutely beautiful, my darling. There is no imperfection in you. Now, yes, there are some things that we don't like about ourselves, but in God's eye, which is whose opinion is really the only opinion that matters, in his eyes, we're perfect. So keep this quote in mind. A flower does not think of competing with the flower next to it. It just blooms. So bloom, girl, and be who God created you to be. Don't you get caught up in the comparison trap.